The following program is rated M. It contains coarse language and violence.
J.P. McGowan has this week thrilled audiences by tying his wife, stuntwoman Helen Holmes, onto train tracks, into the path of a runaway train. J.P. is that square-jawed Australian who is attracting fame by staging spectacular stunts that have never been seen by motion picture audiences.
If you're being tied to the railway tracks, you're inherently good because you're a victim. The idea was to generate as much stimulus as possible to work the audience up into a frenzy. When J.P. McGowan started to make films, film language was very elementary, so he was learning on the job. By 1915, he had mastered and helped develop the language of film which we're familiar with today.
Get ready to fly, bitch!
J.P. McGowan is Hollywood's first ever Australian director. It seems he was born with soot and steam in his blood, growing up in a small railroad town.
J.P. McGowan was born in Terowie in South Australia, which is about 200 kilometres north of Adelaide, in 1880. And then his father got a job in Sydney with the New South Wales Railways. He was a train driver. And so at the age of about 5, Jack moved with his family to Camperdown. And so they lived in very impoverished circumstances. And I think that this is one of the things that motivated Jack throughout his life to get away from that.
Directed by J.P. McGowan. So there's his name. People didn't believe in him when I first started talking about him around South Australia. They disputed where he'd been born. Typically South Australia. They couldn't believe they had someone on their own hands that actually meant something. My real interest in all of this is actually in the man McGowan and what he managed to get done over a period of 20 very active years in filmmaking. McGowan's credits have come now to more than 600, and they're discovering them every day. But every time you look in the directories, you find a new film has popped up that he's been recognised for. He was a big Australian, and he got stuck into things.
Well, J.P. McGowan had an adventurous spirit. He clearly did not want to end up like his father, working out at the Everleigh workshops for all of his life. So he left home at a very early age when he was in his teens, and he sailed off to see as much of the world as he possibly could. And eventually he'd heard about the gold rush in the late 1890s. And so he went to South Africa looking to make his fortune in the gold.
Before coming to America, Mr. McGowan was a decorated Boer War hero. Fighting behind enemy lines with his guerrilla unit, he helped sabotage trains on the African railroads. With that background, it's no wonder he's an expert in demolishing boxcars and engines in his motion pictures.
When the war finished, Jack was at a loose end. until he answered an advert in the paper calling for experienced horsemen to take part in a spectacular show at the St. Louis World's Fair in the United States. The idea was that they would recreate battles of the Boer War, and it was Jack's introduction to show business.
The dominant form of theatre in the 1890s was melodrama, and these were incredibly popular. The theatres were geared up with electrical machinery and mechanical devices so that they could bring in elephants, they could bring in trains, and cars were even on the stage. They were mammoth productions, but they were based on thrills so that audiences would join into the whole production and start yelling and cheering and barracking for one side. Sociologists have speculated it was to do with probably the rapid urbanisation of American cities in the latter part of the 19th century. Cities basically quadrupled between 1870 and 1910, and they were really intense places. Now, at the same time this was happening, we had amusement parks, we had the tabloid newspapers. It wasn't something confined just to the theatre. It was basically an intensification of stimuli. People went along for their amusements to be excited.
The movie industry was just beginning, and it was taking place in New York, where Jack was working at the time. So he went along and he got a job with the KLM company, and that was the beginning of his involvement in the movies.
But I've always found it interesting, at the time when most professional theatrical actors despise movies, J.P. McGowan shifted quickly over to KLM. It was almost as if he welcomed that opportunity to go to a different medium.
The KLM company have recently made motion picture history by taking their crew on location around the globe.
Shooting films at a furious pace, they have visited Europe and even the exotic Middle East.
It's a gamble that has paid off. The new films are packing theatre houses in every state.
He joined KLM basically as an actor. He went overseas for 12 months where he learned his craft. But when he came back, he segued into directing.
So KLM crowned Jack the railroad man. In 1913, they sent him west to the new town of Hollywood, where the film industry was rapidly expanding.
It seems Hollywood's new railroad man is giving audiences all the stunts and thrills they crave.
And with new star Helen Holmes as his heroine, JP's films are breaking box office records.
In attempting to answer the question how I got into the movies, I feel like the little boy who was asked how he came to fall in the river. I didn't come to fall in. I came to fish and fell in by accident.
It was at a party that a mutual friend introduced Jack to Helen. And that was the beginning of a most amazing, productive relationship of a man and a woman who would create some of the most exciting movies ever made in early Hollywood. And in a short time, they got married.
When they met, they were the perfect match. Both of their families came from railroad backgrounds. They both had the shared interest in outdoor life, in horses, in excitement, in doing things. She co-wrote many of the films with McGowan. She co-directed at times. She co-produced. It was not as if he was the director and she was just the actor. It was a shared creative partnership.
Everybody was expected to muck in and do whatever was necessary. And that was the idea. They had to make it happen, and they had to make it happen pretty damn fast because they had to get this episode out into the theatre by next week.
KLM's new series, The Hazards of Helen, is an action-packed saga from J.P. McGowan, which stars his on-screen and off-screen muse, Helen Holmes. Helen plays a telegraph operator who must save the day in each episode, risking life and limb in the process.
The Hazards of Helen proved to be one of the most successful series that was ever made in the silent era.
The Hazards of Helen lasted for the best part of 18 months, and then they got an offer to form their own company, Signal Film Corporation.
In his role as Signal producer, J.P. McGowan was this week doing some fast talking with railroad bosses to secure use of their lines for his upcoming serial. J.P. is known for his on-set catch cry, "Let's go!" And it is with these words that he leads his crew into the hills of Sonora, California, where no production has been before.
Since his new appointment at Signal, McGowan's budgets have increased, but so have our expectation that he produce even greater spectacles.
Are you scared of heights? Are you frightened of fire?
Ignition!
Then we have a movie for you. Grant Page. He is a stuntman.
The thing to me about JP and his work, it was working with reality, not with the inevitable exaggeration that modern technology will give you. And with green screens and wire work and RAMs and things, you're defeating all of Newtonian physics immediately. Whereas back in JP's day, he did it for real. It's set a tradition that we're still carrying on. One of the things that you get at a moment of preparation for a stunt is a huge dose of adrenaline. But it also, it gives you a real animal involvement with people around you, and particularly with two people in love. To have that moment, it would have been great for their relationship. I bet you the evenings after that were fantastic.
J.P. McGowan would not think of himself as an artist, he would think of himself as a commercial filmmaker. Helen Holmes made serials with J.P. McGowan, which made over $2 million profit during this period.
So over 2 years, they made about 15 hours of product, and they were very, very popular. The love affair between Jack McGowan and Helen Holmes is one of the great love stories off-screen of Hollywood. You can feel the energy going into the movies that they made. And it must have been something that was very worrying for Jack when day after day he had to put Helen into dangerous situations.
Well, I have a pair of educated knees. I've learned to drop like a kitten. My body is all bruised and bumped and scarred from the falls that I've had.
She's just one of the boys. If I ask her to jump off a train, then she jumps off a train. There is no hesitation.
There's something perverse about the whole situation. I mean, Helen Holmes was bound and gagged. Helen Holmes was one of the first stunt women. She did most of her own stunts. There weren't stunt women around, so therefore she had to do them. And when J.P. McGowan's directing his wife, and he's placing her in these death-defying situations, literally death-defying, a couple of times where she nearly lost her life.
You know, the stunts that she's doing in there are really impressive, you know, because there's not the safety equipment and features that we have in place now, and we still do stuff like that, but we just have so many more things to make it look that much cooler, which kind of seems unfair that hers looks so much less terrifying to our eye now but in fact was that much more dangerous, technically speaking.
You're not going to want to do what we're doing. What, to drive a car? We're doing more than that. What, drive it fast?
And B, I think just the fact that it's like, things are terrifying when they've not been done before. If I'd never seen someone do a 60-foot high fall and no one in the world had done it and they'd be like, Zoe, do it, I'd be like, are you mental? People are physically capable of jumping off buildings. Some of them might not land on their feet, but a lot of people are physically capable of these things. It's just that they're not wired, you know, so... But that's what I mean, is what's impressive about her is that it was so unusual for her to even attempt that. I didn't even know women were allowed to wear pants at that point.
Helen was certainly Jack's muse. He crafted the movies and made her look good in the stunts, turned her into one of the first of the major movie stars. At the very height of her fame, Helen was as well known as any movie star these days would be.
This is Britney. I mean, in a sense, they're more equivalent to pop stars. Stardom is not absolutely a new cultural phenomenon, but this is stardom on an industrial scale. And the serial queens, the Pearl Whites, the Helen Holmeses, they are among the first movie stars. And the codes of movie stardom are being written in this period around these people.
He was the toughest man, physically, I've ever known. He wrote his own scripts, directed them, and played the character lead in most of them. Then, when he washed up for the day and the rest went home, he'd go to the cutting room and cut and title until 2 or 3 a.m. Then go to the office and sleep on the floor till the janitor woke him up, go home, have breakfast, and be back on the stage before the cast showed up.
I want no man working with me who arrives at the same minute each morning to punch a clock, for he will be quite as punctual in punching it on his way out in the evening. I want the men who come because they're interested.
He would push his crews and himself to the extreme, but it was an amazingly hectic time. On one occasion, during the hazards of Helen, he fell off a telegraph pole.
He was rushed to hospital and he spent weeks in plaster from the waist down, unable to move. But that didn't stop him. Jack would type up scenarios at a portable typewriter balanced in front of him. Helen would come in every day for a briefing.
And Helen Holmes had to do the directing and also the producing of the series. There was no let-up in that. They had to keep the production going.
People kind of packed up around him. There were people who became injured. His chief cameraman had a breakdown, and he obviously led people to beyond where they were happy to go.
Helen Holmes, the original railroad girl, has had a narrow escape from drowning. She was rescued by her director,
Helen Holmes,
J.P McGowan.
the daring stunt woman from the hit serial Girl in the Game, has re-sprained her ankle, confining her to bed
Helen
for 2
Holmes,
weeks.
who is one of Hollywood's leading stunt women, has narrowly avoided being killed by a runaway train.
There was one occasion where he and Helen did decide to take a few weeks off on a trip to Hawaii. But then Jack had the idea that while they were on the boat, instead of just lazing around, as he put it, they might as well make a movie. And so he took all his camera crew and they made not one but a couple of movies while they were on this so-called holiday.
He could not sit still, and that must have driven Helen Holmes mad. That was essentially going to be their honeymoon after a long period of activity.
Helen Holmes, principal in the film series The Hazards of Helen, the screen heroine of railroad wrecks and smash-ups, and her husband J.P McGowan have separated.
I mean, one of the speculations as to why their marriage finally broke up is that this was an intense, dangerous work. He was injured a number of times, and she was injured regularly. Helen Holmes had just had enough.
There's a belief that she was injured in a stunt that went wrong, that she'd lost a finger, some people say. And so abruptly, it was all over. Helen went off and got married to a cowboy stuntman, and she walked away from Jack, and she walked away from her glittering career.
After the divorce, Jack seemed to lose some of his vitality. He looked haggard. See, Jack was a man who seldom let his emotions run away with him. He ruled himself with a rod of iron in most things. But when it came to Helen, that was his weak spot. Yeah, I don't think he ever really recovered from their separation.
Jack plunged back into work. The series westerns were a typical product from what became known as Poverty Row in Hollywood. Poverty Row really just simply referred to the independent companies who would produce anything to make a quick buck.
Poverty Row were made on a very low budget because the margin for profit was very small. In the 20s, the studios controlled all of the major theatres, not just in America, but large parts of the world. Paramount developed, Warner Brothers were formed during this period, but MGM later. But you had the complete vertical integration of the studio, and there was little place for people like J.P McGowan to go. He was an independent who had trouble working within the studio system.
Two major events sucked the life out of his movie career.
And then, in 1927, pictures found their voice.
The first was the invention of sound.
My words that have been recorded on the soundtrack appear like this, as I am now speaking to you from the screen.
The cumbersome sound equipment just made it very difficult for Jack to make the kind of on-the-run movies he'd been very good at.
You keep quiet. Let me do the talking. What's this, Sheriff? I captured your men attempting to steal wild horses off the state refuge, McGowan. Why, that's impossible. What have you got to say about it?
I told the sheriff here was looking for some of them strays you lost.
That's right. I can assure you, Sheriff, it will never happen again. It was entirely an accident.
And the second major event, of course, was the Great Depression.
Hey, Skeeter! Stay where you belong, Skeeter.
You can see the ambition in his films. He's trying to do things that the budget just won't allow. So I would suspect we've got a fairly frustrated filmmaker. He was churning out films, 6, 7, 8-day westerns, and he was trying to make them as good as he possibly could, but the frustration of no money.
Here's another empty shell you can add to your collection, Sinclair.
Right between the eyes that time, Sinclair.
And as the 30s went on, he found directing work increasingly hard to get, and he made a living as a supporting actor, often the lead villain in B westerns.
But then something of a miracle occurred for Jack when producer Nat Levine had the idea of making one last great railroad serial, and he needed the great railroad man to direct it. It was a chance for Jack to bring a lifetime of experience to the creation of this action-packed blockbuster, the Hurricane Express.
Larry, the westbound and Hurricane Express are going to crash.
There was stunts galore, and the Hurricane Express starred young John Wayne. It was a great way for Jack to put a full stop to his career as the railroad man.
J.P McGowan yesterday became the first Australian to receive an honorary life membership from the American Screen Directors Guild. Jack says it is one of the great honors of his career, capping a lifetime spent in the movies.
His legacy for Australians is he's the first important Australian to break through into the Hollywood system. He survived in an industry where it's notoriously difficult to survive. And he was there when they developed the grammar of film, and he was an important part of that.
He made an entire career, 40 years worth, as a performer, director, producer, writer. He did the works, blazing that trail for all those other Australians who came after him in Hollywood.
Hi, I'm Grant Page. I've survived leopard attacks, falls from high towers, and being set on fire. StuntLove.com is a new website I'm hosting that'll take you behind the scenes from J.P. McGowan's day to now.